are talking the horror comedy Exorcism at 60,000 feet. This one is directed by Chad Ferran and stars Robert Miano, Bai Ling, Lance Henriksen. You have smaller appearances from other kind of genre faves as well. Kevin J. O'Connor's Bill Moseley, Adrienne Barbeau, Kelly Maroney. And this is essentially a send-off of clearly The Exorcist, but also the kind of disaster movies of the kind of 70s, and a few of the kind of like older kind of properties as well. Things like Twilight Zone, and there's obviously, you know, there's a couple of movies that it directly kind of references as well. So you've seen this kind of sort of thing before, obviously these spoof-style movies. I guess you would describe this one as Airplane meets Scary Movie. The plot actually focuses on this priest, this exorcist essentially, who has recently defeated, or so he thinks, this particular demon who's inhabited this this guy he used to know from the Vietnam War. And he is on the plane going from America to Vietnam with the body, when of course the demon decides it's going to infest the inhabitants of the plane and chaos ensues. So what will happen? You have to watch the movie to find out. As if you're going to watch this for plot development and stuff. There is a plot here, albeit a wacky, zany one. So first of all, what works in this movie? Okay, so I gotta say the beginning is really strong, and it obviously is riffing on The Exorcist. So if you're a fan of The Exorcist, you're going to enjoy the kind of the introduction, the prologue really to this movie, with the kind of the very similar music, the kind of the camera shots, things like that. And it even references not just the original Exorcist, but some of the sequels as well. And so I thought it was quite nice. And there's scenes that are kind of almost played out, you know, that you would have seen in previous Exorcist movies, but obviously a little bit different with the comedic edge. The special effects are not too bad, to be honest with you. I mean, they're not made to be particularly realistic, but they do a good use of a mix of practical effects with some CGI enhancements, and for the most part, for a relatively low budget movie, it does look pretty good in places, and there are some kind of fun scenes involving you know, some pretty kind of grossed out kind of body horror style kind of horror effects, if that makes sense. Obviously we have a plethora of, you know, recognisable names here if you are a horror fan. And they, you know, they all have kind of speaking parts, and although they are cameos, really, I mean, they are reasonable length cameos is the best way I would describe it. And you know, they all have some kind of quite fun scenes. The majority of them, you know, are kind of passengers on this kind of this plane and stuff like that. And there's various shenanigans that will kind of take place. Obviously, we have our exorcist as our main sort of character, and then Bai Ling is the kind of like the flight attendant, so we'll kind of see them most. Lance Henriksen is the pilot, so we see again a reasonable amount of him. Some of the other characters are just the you know, the people on the plane and things like that. Now, obviously, this is a comedy, so that is very subjective. I'm not the biggest fan of spoof films. I don't mind a couple of them. And there were some jokes here that I think when it directly references films, and because I'm of a certain age where I can remember older films, I think some of the jokes appealed to me. But I've got to say, I think one of the maybe the issues is that the jokes are, it's riffing on older properties rather than newer properties. Now, a lot of these spoof movies, if we think about, you know, the scary movies, they'll tend to parody things that are current, things that are in the cinema the previous year, whilst this one is parodying movies that are in the cinema decades ago. So I don't think people in our 20s necessarily are going to be all that fussed. But I think maybe older people may find some of the jokes funny, but then possibly be put off by the ludicrous, zany and juvenile humour. I mean, let me give you an example of the joke. There's a kind of a running gag in this movie where Bai Ling's character gets a used tampon stuck in her hair, and then it ends up going from various people in their mouths and things like this, and people not realising it shoots in their mouth, things like that. That will give you an idea of the humour. So if that sounds funny to you, then check it out. This is going to be the movie for you. But if it just sounds gross or stupid, then maybe not. So humour is not something I can objectively say it's good, it's bad. It is obviously down to yourself. So let's kind of bear that in mind. I think the cast are pretty fun. They look like they're having a lot of fun with this movie. You know, it is obviously a bit of a joke film, so they do kind of, you know, they do have fun with it. There are a couple of scenes here that are played a bit more on the horror side rather than the comedy, but obviously that it's got a joke right next to it, things like that. So there are a couple of things here. And there are some external shots of the plane, obviously kind of CGI, which I thought looks pretty good. What doesn't work for me, now obviously the humour is something you have to decide for yourself. But there are maybe a few other things for me that I kind of felt were a little weak. The music, although I really enjoyed the music at the beginning of the movie, it has this kind of like this whimsical comedy score through the movie. And when there are bits of what are meant to be quote unquote horror, we still have a fairly kind of whimsical score to it, which I felt, you know, when you're meant to have more horror bits, even though it's played for laughs, I didn't think the horror, the kind of the jokey music really suited those scenes, to be honest. Now, it keeps it from being taken seriously at any point, and maybe that was the idea here. But personally, I would have thought I would have maybe preferred had we had it switched up a little bit. On the subject of the music, there are instances here where I feel the audio levels have been recorded a little bit poorly. So there is obviously music overlaid to the kind of the speaking track, and I feel sometimes the music is recorded at a little bit of a higher level than it should be, because we're not quite able to understand sometimes what characters are saying, because the music is kind of too loud in certain scenes, which is a little bit distracting. I think maybe for me personally, once we kind of get on the plane, there's a relatively chunky section of time where we're not really seeing the supernatural stuff. And it got to a point with that, when I was watching that, and it was kind of like, I want the kind of, you know, the supernatural stuff to start happening now. We kind of got jokes with, you know, people kind of doing silly stuff regardless. And we have this crazy, eccentric kind of bunch of kind of like OTT characters, all very acting, you know, hyperactive and stuff like this. And then we have, you know, what it seems to be quite a long time, then the kind of the possession stuff starts to happen. So it felt like maybe that should have happened a little earlier. And then I don't think they did quite enough with it when we actually did have the possession stuff. I think there was more to mine here than they did. And they rely quite a lot on kind of gross out gags and stuff like that. And then not so much on the kind of the kind of the pop reference, the pop culture references. The first half of the movie, well, not even the first half, the first third of the movie, I feel was quite heavy with riffing on popular scenes from television, things like The Twilight Zone, and obviously movies and stuff like that. But then when we get kind of later on in the movie, it just seems to switch to more standard juvenile gross out gags and things like that, and kind of just like, you know, humour that isn't necessarily based on, there's a couple that happen, but, you know, not so much, to be honest. So it was a bit like there could have been, I think, scenes that could have been done a little bit better than that, a little bit kind of maybe have some more kind of, if you're going to reference a lot of kind of older movies, there could have been more done, I feel, within that kind of that sort of second half of the movie, because it felt a little bit light on the kind of like the riffing of the kind of the older movies at the beginning of the movie had so much. But I really enjoyed the cast here, and it obviously goes at a brisk pace with kind of lots of kind of grossed out humour and kind of funny effects. No, obviously not taking itself too seriously, but there are a couple of characters that, like the priest, for example, takes it relatively serious, and I thought it was quite good. But it's not one I would potentially ever rewatch, I don't think. Like I said, I'm not the biggest fan of spoof movies. The only one that I've really legitimately enjoyed was Not Another Teen Movie, I think. And but even things like Scary Movie and superhero movies, which take the piss out of genres that I like, they're okay, but I can only really watch them once, and this one is kind of falls into that category. But objectively speaking, obviously I can't speak for everyone in regards to their humour tastes. So I will say it's probably worth a watch if you don't mind those those kind of like scary movie. Airplane was the one that really set the bar for here, and that's obviously the kind of the template for this film, mixed in with the kind of the horror elements as well. But I'm just going to give it a 5 out of 10. It's fun, but not particularly memorable. I wouldn't have any real desire to kind of see it again. Although it was nice watching all the kind of like the actors that we've known from previous stuff. This is almost like what Death House should have been in regards to having these horror icons together to a certain degree. A little bit better than Death House, what can I tell you? 5 out of 10. Have you seen it? What did you think of it? Leave me a comment and I'll look forward to seeing you next time. Bye for now.